Welcome back to our last panel session of the conference, Funding for Change, the Challenge of Resourcing Rebellious Lawyering. This may be our last panel session for the conference, apart from our closing plenary, which we hope everyone can make it to as well. But it was actually one of the first parts of the conference that all of us co-organisers agreed should be in the program. And that's because funding legal work focused on systemic change is a perennial challenge. And the kinds of resource available to us within an oppressive system of capitalism can restrict the ambition and the impact of the work we do. In Australia, so much of the social justice sector relies on government funding, and the precarity of that funding and the increasing pressure to focus on direct service delivery rather than advocacy for change has put a hold on our ability to reach beyond traditional models of lawyering. So increasingly we see people looking to work more closely with social movements, are looking at philanthropy to help fund that work. But of course we know that comes with its own set of problems and innate power imbalances. So we wanted to have this session so we could examine some of these issues head on. And we hope today's panel discussion provides you both with a few practical strategies for navigating the world of philanthropy, but also a chance to critically reflect on the dynamics that determine who controls money and priorities. So to help unpick all of this with us, we have an extraordinary panel today. I'll just go around and do introductions. So starting with Jen Robinson, who we're really thrilled could join us. Jen's an international philanthropist and Australian human rights lawyer, based at Doughty Street Chambers in London. She's best known for her work with high-profile clients, including Julian Assange, WikiLeaks and New York Times, in cases that focus on free speech and civil liberties. She's also founded the Bertha Justice Initiative, which supports human rights lawyers around the world and promotes movement lawyering. And I just want to say also that Jen has supported this conference from its inception and is part of why we've been able to pull it off. So we're really privileged to have online Liv Meadow, who's been involved in the youth climate movement over 10 years as a fundraiser, helping environmental NGOs have the biggest impact possible. She's currently an ally fundraising director at SEED Indigenous Youth Climate Network, and she's also a founder of the Fundraisers Idea Exchange and a board member at Climate for Change. Also with us today is Rachel English, a philanthropic advisor at Mutual Trust, assisting families with their giving strategies. She's also a director of the English Family Foundation. She's previously served as a co-chair of NEXUS Australia, part of a global network uniting young investors, social entrepreneurs and philanthropists to accelerate change. Making philanthropy more accessible has been a core part of Rachel's work. And finally, but not least, Catherine Brooks is a senior advisor at Wendy Brooks and Partners Consulting, where her work focuses on helping non-profit organisations amplify their impact on social change through strategic fundraising. And she's also previously worked as an employment lawyer assisting non-profits with governance and strategic planning. So we're so lucky to have the four of you online with us today. I'm going to start right into it all. And we will have hopefully some time for questions and Q&A at the end from the audience, so keep your questions coming in if you can. But starting first with you, Jen, I want to ask, as lawyers are seeking to move away from traditional models of lawyering and towards movement lawyering, I'm interested to get your perspective on how you think funding is also changing. Sorry, Jen, you might just...
Sorry, Brooke, I just lost you. I just dropped out and I didn't get your question. If you don't mind saying that again.
Definitely. So as lawyers are seeking to move away from traditional models of lawyering towards movement lawyering models, what's your perspective on how funding is also changing in that process? Is it changing and how?
Well, thank you for the question, and just in Broome and pay my respects to traditional owners here and to wherever you are. I guess as a lawyer who's worked both in philanthropy and as a lawyer doing this work, I have a pretty unique perspective on changing. Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
We can. There's just a little lag, but I think we're okay. Oh, Jen, we might just come back to you in a second. Go to our next question. So I might turn to Liv now, because I know that as a fundraising director in the youth climate movement, you've had to tackle this issue as well. And I'm interested in your experience of how different funding models have affected the types of work you can do.
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. I think testing out different models is so important. There's obviously so many pros and cons for all, and do often find that a lot of charities have an over-reliance on government funding, which makes sense. You know, they have some very large grants out there, but along with that comes like a lot of paperwork and a lot of restrictions. So I've been lucky enough to work with 2 charities who don't accept any government funding, which I found really allowed me to explore and test different revenue streams, and allowed our work to have a lot more flexibility and creativity and just a general ability to drive impact. So a couple of those streams that had that positive impact were digital fundraising. So that really enabled us to educate our supporter base and get the message out far and wide like we could never really have before, and also inspire those supporters to take action. Our regular giving program as well, so people signing on for a monthly gift that allows long-term sustainability, and because those donations are committed, we can really plan ahead with confidence, and also that kind of funding, we have a bit of flexibility within that as well. So that's always nice for movements to have. And then also appeals. So like in a rapid response moment, if something's hitting the fan, we can really like quickly launch something and show the urgency with it through a crowdfunder or something like that, and really rally some supporters behind us and have some really tangible impact. So I think with streams like that and so many more, I think we can really build and educate our base and implement sustainable models, so we're not really being restricted by terms of funders, and particularly with government grants and things like that, which can be quite restrictive. And it just generally allows more agency in the work that we're doing, so we can have more impact. And lastly, I think, yeah, underlying all of that is just like such importance of diversifying your revenue streams and having a whole bunch on hand, and really testing what works with you, because I think not only can that help you mitigate risks, but it also finds fundraising streams that are meaningful and more values aligned, just to help you and enable your movement or organisation to have more impact.
Thanks, Liv. That's I think a really useful point about diversifying funding pathways. And so I think we do have Jen back on the line now, so I might throw to you, Jen, if you're able to speak. We'll see if this works.
I'm going to keep my video off. Can you hear me okay now?
It's great, thank you.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, Jen, but it does seem like there's still a bit of...
As someone who has worked as a lawyer and in philanthropy, I have a pretty unique perspective on both sides of the I'm going to have to log out, guys. Sorry.
So fine, Jen. See you back on here. So we're moving right along. I mean, there's probably a lot of people online who have had experience in fundraising or are considering how to fund the work that they want to do. And I'm interested, I might throw to you next, Rachel, just if people are considering philanthropic funding as an option, what are some key things that they need to know about Australian philanthropy?
Thanks, Brooke, and well done for everything that you guys are doing in the joys of having a digital conference. Obviously, you can't predict everything. But just I suppose, fast facts about philanthropy from a bit of a philanthropy nerd. But Australia is a pretty generous nation by many standards, not by all. We give about $13 billion annually from individuals and corporations, and that goes up to $37 billion if you include volunteering, which for a group of lawyers, you'd be very aware with all of the pro bono work that you all do. But that is dwarfed by the government, who gives $77 billion annually, or about 85% of annual donations to nonprofits, to Liv's earlier point about, the influence of government and how the kind of influence that they have over organisations. We're fourth in the world giving index, looking at money, time and acts of service, like fourth highest country, but we fall behind most of our OECD counterparts when you look at just the financial, which, to be honest, is the element that most of us are interested in this panel, I suppose. So we give about 0.8% of GDP annually. But the typical giver in Australia is a woman in her 40s, earning between 52 and 65 grand a year. She's not the picture that we have of typical philanthropist, but she's doing a lot of the heavy lifting, particularly with the kinds of fundraising that Liv was talking about, like the digital fundraising and the monthly giving programs. Unsurprisingly, women give more than men. Just another reason to fix the gender wage gap. But our picture of a philanthropist is of a older, wealthy white man, pale, male, stale, if you will. And many of them are incredibly generous, doing very impactful grant making, but in reality, only half of the people who earn over 500 grand a year make any tax deductible donations. And that rate isn't increasing, despite the combined wealth of Australian billionaires rising by 52% from December 2019 to 2020, so through the pandemic. The good news is, though, that those pale, male and stale people, like all of us here, will die someday. And with that comes a growing intergenerational wealth transfer. So in Australia, that is $2.6 trillion by 2040. It's $1.1 trillion in the next 10 years. And that's being passed down to young people who are more likely to be passionate about advocacy, be more aware of climate change and the growing inequalities that we face. Globally, it's estimated that half of that wealth transfer will be donated to charitable activities. So these are your people, I suppose. It'd be remiss of me not to plug NEXUS Australia, which Brooke mentioned is a network of young philanthropists and social change makers working together to create change. And funding advocacy and more progressive philanthropy is a very regular conversation for our members. So I'd say try not to forget that wealthy, powerful people often have kids that have access and can get in their ears in the ways that a lot of other people can't. So as a broad sweeping snapshot of Australian philanthropy.
That is so useful and so interesting, Rachel. Thanks for that really comprehensive overview in a short space of time. I might just throw to Catherine next on that, because I guess I'm interested in hearing practically what is needed to attract philanthropy for movement lawyering initiatives. What are philanthropists looking for when they come across a project like this?
Yeah, sure, Brooke. Thank you so much. And I'll just mention that I'm on the lands of the Wadawurrung people, so I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So yeah, Rachel's just given such a great snapshot. I'll have to steal her notes because our slides are nowhere near as good as those. I think there is an amazing piece of the pie for people to really tap into philanthropy. So our job from Wendy, Brooks and Partners is to work out how we can best position an organisation to be able to get the funding that they deserve. And so what we say and how to do that is to really start with a solid case for support. And we think that embedded within your case for support, so that's like a really consolidated pitch material, so about 3 or 4 pages, which really talks to your theory of change. We think that a theory of change is a really amazing and sophisticated way to communicate to sophisticated funders such as Rachel around why you're doing the work that you're doing, to what end. It's really important to be able to have in your theory of change an end goal. And so I think that in answer to your question, Brooke, I think you really need to have a clear understanding of why you're doing the work that you do and have that really big picture, big impact, the blue sky ambition, because a lot of philanthropists have seen many of the same applications before, many of the same organisations before, and fundamentally, people fund people. So they want to know that you've got leadership, that you've got ambition, and sometimes it's really scary, and we have to talk with our CEOs or chairs of board to convince them that it's okay to put into a document something that you're not sure you can achieve, but something that you're existing for this higher purpose. So to be really ambitious. As lawyers, we all know that you also need to have good governance, and you need to have at least, if you've got a board, you have to at least have an accountant and a lawyer on the board to get even past that first step. So good governance is key. And as I said, people do fund people. So if you can profile any of the significant people that are in your organisation, whether that's, for example, a First Nations person, if you're doing a First Nations project, or someone that has particular areas of expertise, or someone even that might be known to other funders. So someone that has an AO, someone that has some credibility within the social sector that you're operating in. I think that can be really key as well. I can see Liv nodding, so she's obviously had some similar experiences there, and happy for other people to jump in. But yeah, I think you need to have sort of big ambition. You need to be able to communicate your need and your why, to what end, and then you need to make sure you've got your good governance in place as well.
Just to jump in there, Catherine, I think that's so true. Like, particularly like the why, the theory of change, like it can feel like such a faff for an organisation to have to go through that process when they're so clear on what they're wanting to do. But I think for, particularly when it's, you know, like advocacy based or movement based, to have like, this is what we're doing and that's why we're doing these steps down here, because it can feel a few steps removed for philanthropists that are very rarely the, you know, the smartest person in the room, very rarely the person who's like spent all of their days working in this space. So to be able to clearly articulate, like, this is why we're doing, you know, going door to door, and why we're having these kind of conversations, because we're ultimately going to get to this goal and we know how we're going to get there, is really helpful.
Thanks to you. And Liv, did you want to jump in there at all?
No, that's fine. I was nodding in agreement because I truly believe that, and have had a lot of learnings with that this year, supporting the work at Seed, and just making sure that even as a fundraiser, I'm making sure to elevate the voices of others rather than, you know, putting my own in there, just stepping back when appropriate. So yeah, I think that's really great.
It's definitely been a theme of the conference so far, this idea of storytelling and how we step back and allow the voices of communities impacted by injustice and social movements take the forefront, and particularly given that that's really the most effective way ultimately of bringing about the kinds of change we want to see. I'd actually be really curious, Liv, to hear if you had an example of that.
Of elevating voices or the storytelling?
Yes, yeah, in a fundraising context.
Yeah. It's been a really interesting journey. I started supporting Seed, Indigenous Youth Climate Network, this year, and coming on as an ally fundraiser, it's a bit of a tension, I guess, of coming in without lived experience and really wanting to put Seed first, and the staff and volunteers and all the impact work they're doing. So really just making sure that within the organisation things are really clear of who's going to be in the room with the funder, who's going to approve things, so it's not my voice that's really coming through. I'm really championing the work that Seed is doing. So I think that's a general example, I guess, within grants and donor meetings, but just making sure that you really understand the mission and the theory of change, like Catherine was talking about, of the organisation. So when you are that person in communicating it, you can really explain on people's behalf. But yeah, I mean, whenever I can, I'm not in the room, hopefully, and I'm working myself out of a job as quickly as possible. But yeah, I think kind of imparting your knowledge as well, and making sure you can support and mentor people to who do have that lived experience to then take the reins and go for it is the ultimate goal. And so I think, yeah, writing down all of your lessons and yeah, supporting other people to take the reins is really important as well.
We should probably flag that this is a pretty homogenous looking panel while we're having these conversations about, you know, how do we incorporate other community voices and
Totally.
people's experience.
Yeah, I think
work in progress.
It's a really important thing to point out, and I think it goes to show, you know, how hard it is to put together a more diverse panel on this issue. It goes to show how difficult it is and how much work we still have to do. Jen, I might throw to you. I see Jen's coming in and out a little bit. Let's give it another shot. Can you hear us, Jen? Oh, it still seems to be not quite working there.
Can you hear me now? I'm on the phone, so I don't know whether it's different.
We can hear you now.
Great.
So did you want to have a crack again at that first question? Just, hearing how you think the funding space is shifting as lawyers start to move towards movement lawyering models?
Sure, I think there was a big shift in Australia, and something that I observed as a lawyer who has both worked in movements and continues to work with movements, but also someone who moved into the philanthropic space simply because of my frustration about how the struggles of having to fund this work and how we fund this work as lawyers. So I think the big challenge that came in Australia, which really got me thinking about it, was when George Brandis pulled EDO's funding because of their campaigning work. And that really made me think seriously about the limitations of government funding this work when you have a government calling strategic litigation lawfare and a government that is cutting funding to the EDO because they're advising activists on what I think was absolutely legitimate forms of civil disobedience to prevent fracking. And that's when we started thinking seriously about, well, what other opportunities are there in Australia to fund this work, to move away from a model where government, when you're actually effective, and you're effective when you piss government off, in my view, that you're not going to have your funding at risk. So we started to think about alternative models. And I do think there's an issue in Australia in the sense that we don't have a huge philanthropic culture. So the size of the foundations that we have in Australia aren't the same of what we'll see, for example, in the United States, where there's a very, very different philanthropic culture. And so that got me thinking about how do we develop a more progressive philanthropic funding model in Australia, one that's independent of government, and to help to build a space in Australia where there are more philanthropists coming into this space. In the interim, we thought about setting up a fund, and my frustration was that, I took a job in a foundation to fund movement lawyering, to create a program to fund movement lawyering around the world. And I did so on the basis that I'd be able to do it in Australia first, because this is my home country and this is where I want to contribute. But I got pushback from the board immediately, and they didn't want to fund in Australia. And that's one thing that I think is important for Australian groups to understand, is that there is very little appetite, if any, and I'd say almost none, for international philanthropists to fund in Australia in the same way that we see Open Society or Oak Foundation or some of these big human rights funding organisations funding all over the world, even in the UK and the US and in various countries in Europe. They don't want to come to Australia because Australia is perceived as being a very wealthy country and there should be funding here. So how do we cultivate and develop more progressive domestic sources of income? And that's how we started with the Grata Fund. It was really out of my frustration about what I was seeing not happen in the space and how limited, I think, more radical forms of organising and litigating were not happening in Australia, which was a combination of factors, I think, the lack of philanthropic support being tied to government support, and also the way that adverse costs work in Australia. And that's why we ended up setting up the Grata Fund to create a crowd justice funding model by which is kind of inspired in many ways by what we saw happen with the Obama administration, or the Obama election campaign, and also my own experience seeing the way that WikiLeaks had managed to fundraise significant amounts of money appealing to the public so that they weren't beholden to any particular institutional or individual funder. And I think the Grata Fund's been quite successful in fundraising money both from philanthropists but maintaining an independence from philanthropists. So philanthropists donating to an organisation which funds this kind of litigation but is one step removed from the donor and is more connected to community groups. And I do think that we've been really effective in fundraising significant amounts of money from the community and also from philanthropy to be able to fund innovative and exciting litigation in Australia. But I still think we have a long way to go, and there's a lot of room to create more space. I mean, if I was a billionaire, I would just be funding this stuff. That's it. That's my message to philanthropists: fund litigation.
Great message, Jen. I hope it's heard loud and clear. So I guess we also wanted to sort of look, and we might shift tack a little bit in this panel, because I really, one of the themes of this conference and of movement lawyering generally, and we've already touched on this, but it's really about how we shift power to communities impacted by social justice, by injustice, and to social movements. And I guess maybe just flicking back to you, Rachel, and we have touched on this already, but how uncomfortably or uncomfortably does that even as a concept sit with a philanthropic funding model?
Thanks, Brooke. And just to further to what Jen was talking about, you know, with making it difficult to fund sort of advocacy, what the government's doing, changing the ACNC regulations around advocacy work will make it infinitely more difficult and much more important to have sort of people that aren't as concerned about the tax deductions funding this sort of work, if that's what's at risk for a lot of organisations. But to your question, Brooke, I'd say it's getting more comfortable and more mainstream. More funders are thinking deeply about their role in society and what and the way that that impacts others. Don't get me wrong though, there's a lot of elite philanthropy. It's still about elite causes. People still fund their private school alma maters that don't benefit anyone other than those that could already pay the school fees. And philanthropy can be used as a form of reputation laundering, as a form of power that's largely unaccountable, untransparent, protected in perpetuity and tax advantaged. But I do believe that that is changing, and I suppose I have to be working in this space, parts of it at least. Philanthropy, yes, is an expression of power, but it's also an expression of love and of duty, and I'm seeing that thoughtful expression of love a lot more often. People are reckoning with their position in society and trying to make good with it. You know, there are groups like Resource Generation committed to equitable distribution of wealth and land and power, and these sorts of conversations are becoming a bit more mainstream, as I said. And while I see it talked about more often than I see it acted on, there are examples domestically, and I think that we'll see more progressive philanthropy coming in the future years. And this has been illustrated by a report that Deloitte recently issued that covered 4 new trends in philanthropy after interviewing philanthropists and philanthrocrats, like people that work in philanthropy. I won't go through all of them, but 2 of the 4 were about rethinking philanthropy's role in society, the structures and the systems, and funders thinking about what extent they can share, seed, and use their power. So starting to share power with community and grantees, or giving power over completely. And others are using their power intentionally to take clear positions on the changes that they want to see, to open doors, create spaces at tables that communities just wouldn't have access to otherwise. Obviously, this is still problematic because it's a change that certain individuals want to see rather than societal changes, but it's a step in the right direction. And in saying all of that, just would say that change comes at the speed of trust, and you'll find progressive funders who want to back causes and redistribute wealth and power, but it probably won't be overnight. This is a new frontier, and a lot of philanthropists, you know, there's an education to be had, and a lot of concepts that are challenging to the core of who many philanthropists are. You know, like the philanthropists that I work with at Mutual Trust would be heartbroken to think that they were exploiting and perpetuating their power in any way. But of course, that's part of the issue because it's so counter to what we believe in our hearts. It's so hard to acknowledge it. So all to say that there's a time commitment needed to build those relationships and for people to go on and join on a journey if they're not currently there. But I think more people are at least on that journey somewhere.
Thanks, Rachel. And I'm interested, Catherine, in hearing your thoughts on this too. Like in your experience, to what extent do philanthropists have any self-reflection of the power dynamics in that funding relationship and their role in that?
Oh yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think most of the fundraisers on this panel would agree, if you've met one funder, you've met one funder. So every single philanthropist in their own right is unique and individual, and every trusted foundation will be run in a different way. So I think there are some that are certainly, as Rachel said, beginning to see more around the power, but at Wendy, Brooks and Partners, we still believe there's a massive issue when it comes to white supremacy in this country. We just need to constantly talk about it and work on it to be able to break that down, because fundamentally there is a power imbalance. And as Rachel mentioned before, there is a massive lack of transparency in Australia, which Jen mentioned, you know, the different culture that's happening in the US. It's a much more transparent system in the US. And so I think some of those changes would benefit Australia as a society if there's more transparency around funding. Because then we're able to explore those funding relationships in a lot more of an opaque way. So I think that one of the things that I would recommend to consider is focusing on relationships with funders to really identify those funders that connect with your cause and your mission, and really try and make sure that when you're seeking funding, you're still remaining true to your cause and to your purpose and to those within your community, to make sure that you're attracting the right funding, the funding that's going to really help your core. And to that extent, I think it is really important to have a discussion around what you want your fundraising policy to be around, and just to be really clear from a leadership perspective on where you're going to accept funds from and who from, and where you will steer clear of, to make sure that you're still, as I said, living out that core of what it is that you're trying to do. And I guess the last point I would say is that my father wrote a really interesting blog recently, in which he said that fundraising is not about money, it's about impact. And at the core of that, we really do need to consider the power imbalance, and to be continuously looking not just at the money we're getting, but what we're able to do with that money. So I think that's a really important concept to think about as well.
Thanks, Catherine. And I might turn to you now, Liv, just because we've had already in the conference today a number of different themes raised about funding in a movement lawyering context. And I mean, in social movements, there are limited resources and competing priorities, and that's particularly true for the climate movement. So I guess really interested to hear your thoughts about, and you've touched on this in your answer earlier, but specifically who should decide where the money is spent, and what are the priorities?
Yeah, that's a great one. Oh, is that Jen jumping in?
No, sorry, Liv, that was just me. Just saying, okay. It's just a small question for you to chew on.
Yeah, no worries. I think, like I mentioned before, if those with lived experience can be the ones to decide and be in the room and decide on those priorities, that's the absolute dream. But I think, yeah, ultimately the power should be held with the charity or the movement in determining what their priorities are and where the funds are spent and how they're spent. It just really helps them to create more impact, and because that means it's coming directly from their strategy rather than trying to squeeze into guidelines or just to please donors and kind of seek funding and hopefully not compromising anything to receive funds. I think that's a risk of when there's such limited resources out there. You can kind of try to bend into different areas that you don't quite fit in. And then, that just has an impact on your strategy and the work that you can deliver. So I think in my experience, what's helped with this, and it's already been touched on, is just developing really deep and trusting relationships with the donors. I think that's crucial. The trust needs to be there, and just like being able to set those expectations and make that really clear. And then only sharing pre-existing plans. I think that kind of helps in setting the priorities. You don't want to create a project just to get the funding. You always want to have something that's already in place. And of course, you still want to, have open conversations and hear advice from donors. But ultimately the people who are working on the ground, they'll know what their priorities are, and they should be the ones to dictate them. And I think thinking through like a mindset of lawyers coming into the space, I think it's somewhat similar. Like you need to be coming in and listening and respecting that you're coming into a space of experts. And while you've got legal expertise, it's the messaging of the movement that needs to shine through, and you're there to kind of elevate that cause and like almost being that middle person, which is really important.
Can I jump in there, Brooke?
Yeah, please do.
I think it's just really important that around what Liv said, because in relation to having a really great case for support and pitching your theory of change, rarely do funders provide funding for an organisation. It's really around priority projects. So it is really important to really understand what you're pitching for and having a couple of specific projects that you need funding for ready on the go. Because if you do provide your case for support, as Liv said, then the funders, if they're interested, will ask for specific project business plans. And if you don't have them ready, it will look pretty bad. So it's great to have those pitches ready to go. And the reason why we recommend a minimum of 2 pitches or 2 project business plans is because a funder might, one might resonate, whereas the other might not. So it's really important to have a couple up your sleeve. But again, the importance of building that relationship so that hopefully you already know what the funder is interested in funding. So at least you're sort of close to the mark before you're putting something to them. But we actually run a priority projects game with leadership teams when we're going through the strategy, and we'll actually give people a pretend $1 million and get them to spend their $1 million on the 6 projects that have been identified by the leadership team as the sort of key ones that they're passionate about. And it's a really fantastic way to see if people had their own money, where would they be putting them? Because it's putting you in the shoes of a funder, and it's really asking you to think about, where are we going to get the best impact here? If I spent my money, where would we see the best return on our money? And that's a really great project a really great exercise to consider going through as well.
Thanks, Catherine. Picking up on some of those themes, I kind of want to pull Jen in again, if you can hear us, Jen. Let's see if this works. Just, I guess, for those who are interested in movement theory, is there a fundamental inconsistency with fundraising in the current system and the principle of shifting power to movements? And is it possible to do that with integrity?
I think it's a really important question. I think it's a difficult one. Something I struggled with working in philanthropy, having been a lawyer in the movements and then funding many people who I'd worked with and were my colleagues, it was really difficult for me to acknowledge, and ultimately the point I got to was that I couldn't fix the power imbalance. It was there and I just had to acknowledge it and work with it, because my relationships fundamentally changed with the movements and lawyers who I'd once worked with once I was a philanthropist and working in philanthropy. And so I think it's important just to acknowledge that power imbalance is there. I agree with a lot of what has been said, particularly what Rachel said around philanthropists often do have their heart's in the right place. But it's acknowledging that power imbalance, and I think a lot of philanthropists struggle with that. So I do think we're never going to get away from it. I think there's also some difficulties too, that inherently philanthropy is based upon what the particular foundation and its founders have their own preferences and priorities about what they want to do. And we've just heard a bunch of interventions then, which are all absolutely correct about the way in which funding happens and why you need to try and pick a foundation that does what it has a priority area that matches what you do. And that fundamentally annoys me, because you've got a bunch of rich people determining the priorities of how social justice money is going to be spent when it's not based on what is needed in the community. And that is a fundamental frustration and tension that I don't know that we're ever going to get around unless we abolish philanthropy, put it into a big pot and have a bunch of independent experts give it out. And perhaps that would be the way forward, but of course that is a utopia that's never going to happen and will probably have its own corruption. So, I mean, I do think it's just something that we have to acknowledge and work with and find ways of working with. But I agree that groups that are looking to raise money from philanthropy, you really need to identify foundations that have a value fit with your own. And I think that also in that relationship, I know this sounds odd, but there's a bit of education that you need to do with the foundations you work with about the movement you're working with, about your needs, and hopefully bring them along a path, because sometimes there is room to move, and with the right foundation and the right program officers and the right boards in place, you can actually achieve what you want. And there's a huge amount of opportunity, but I don't think that we can get away from those power imbalances or the fundamental warped fact that very wealthy people are determining the priorities of where social justice money is being spent.
So That's fantastic, Jen. Thanks. Super helpful to start thinking about how we do that on both sides of the fundraising equation. I guess I'm going to open up for questions now because we've got a few coming in. One that sort of links back to a previous session, the abolition panel. There was an issue raised where about the complicity of accepting funds from governments and from donors that have a financial interest in propping up the prison industrial complex. And I'm really interested to hear the thoughts that you have, not just in that context but also in many other contexts, about how to identify those issues and how to how we can kind of address them. So maybe I'll start with Rachel and then I'll go to some others.
Thanks, Brooke. Yeah, it's interesting because I'm a middleman. Like, I just work between organisations and philanthropists, and so every now and then I'm talking to an organisation. They don't know who the funder is that I'm inquiring on behalf of, and more and more I'm starting to have people go, can you just let me know who the funder is, because we have requirements. Like, there are some people in some industries that we're not going to be accepting money from, so I don't want to go down this path if we're ultimately going to have our board say, no, we don't want their money. And I never saw that a couple of years ago, and I'm seeing it more now. And I think that that's really strong and it's really important. And again, I think is indicative of, community organisations sort of backing themselves and not just bending to the whim of a funder. And even within foundations, we're starting to see more, people talking about like ethical investing. They're like, well, are we investing in, we're granting towards healthcare and then we're investing in tobacco? Like, how do we reckon with this, like even within an organisation itself? And so I think that those conversations are happening quite broadly, but I think it's up to organisations to decide what they're comfortable with and what they're not comfortable with, and I think particularly First Nations organisations, like they accepting money from mining companies or, oil and gas companies, and like, how does that go? Or if the money's going to be used, is it better that it's used in your organisation where there's going to be impact and there's going to be effective change happening? And I think that's only for organisations within themselves to grapple with and decide.
I'm happy to jump in there as well, just to add on, because I've been that person on the other end of the phone line asking about the donor and trying to find out where funding has come from, because it's been something that's really important in the climate movement. So we're not being hypocritical, I guess. It's like we're trying to fight for a more just and sustainable future. So if we're taking any funding from something that's related to the fossil fuel industry or mining or even tobacco or the government, it can kind of contradict our purpose, and we can also be held accountable by them. On the flip side, they could just turn around and say that you accepted our funding, so we're supporting you in doing this. So there's some interesting comms risks that come along with it too, but in my experience, I've found it's really helpful to propose and agree on a due diligence policy that you have internally, like the fundraising policy we were talking about earlier, that really dictates your threshold as an organisation or a movement in what you can and can't accept. And we often use like a traffic light system of like green, orange and red light. And the orange lights are kind of the confusing points, because sometimes it is a bit of a case-by-case basis. It could be someone who inherited wealth from an area that you might disagree with, but they're a new generation and they had nothing to do with that. So there can be some blurry lines, but I think having those conversations internally and then with the funders is really important. We've started just being really open and honest and finding that responses have been really positive with donors, because you're coming at it with integrity and it's just matching the work that you're doing, and even creating forms. So then it's for your average donor, they can also fill it out and you can show how you can connect on a values basis, which creates a more meaningful relationship as well.
Thanks, Liv. And I guess, Catherine, this is sort of this interesting idea of recycling donation. I guess when a donor's history might be not currently involved in something, but they have a history of it, and how do you go deeper into that background? I don't know if you have any thoughts to add to what Liv and Rachel have already said.
I think unfortunately in Australia there'd be very few white people, privileged people, that have earned their money in today's sort of level of cleanliness, so to speak. Like we're a country built on colonization and some pretty awful atrocities which we say are continuing on now with our First Nations people. So I think it is a difficult area. It is, as Liv said, in those orange when the orange flags come up, you'll have to make a call yourselves. But I think, again, we would always say, people fund people, build the relationships with the funders. You get to know them yourselves. You really meet with them and talk with them around your ethics and what you stand for and what the organisation is trying to achieve. In relation to the question pertaining to government funding, I think we certainly believe as an organisation that government should be funding service delivery. And so there wouldn't be an organisation that I've worked with where we've said, don't, stop accepting government funding. And a huge percentage of our clients do receive probably 40 to 60% of their funding through government. And I would also say that there's a lot of philanthropists that want to see that government also believes in your projects and in the work that you're doing. Philanthropists love to see that you're able to leverage funding. So if government, for example, one of our clients at the moment, Welfare Rights Centre in Sydney, the government provides them with some funding for their domestic violence work that they do, but philanthropy is really supportive of then being able to leverage off that funding to really make a much broader impact. So I think it's important to think about how you can maximise your impact, whether that's through government and then philanthropy assisting on top of. And philanthropy is a really amazing source to test out innovative new projects that you want to do. Sometimes government will require evidence that something's going to work before they'll fund a project, and philanthropy can be a really amazing source to provide that funding so that you can actually be creative. I loved how Rachel used that term before, because it does enable creativity and it can enable us to think outside the square as an organisation in the not-for-profit world that may have been doing something quite poorly for a long period of time. Say, for example, in the child protection space, we are able to really see some success stories because philanthropy has enabled a not-for-profit to be able to trial new projects. So, I think there's pros and cons of each, and it's great that we're having this discussion, but I think as an organisation, each organisation will have to think very carefully on these issues individually.
Thanks, Catherine. Actually, you've just partly answered another group of questions that we had coming in, and I might also go to Jen on this because it's an interesting point that someone's making. Are we sort of letting government off the hook by moving entirely away from, or seeking to move away from government funding? Where is the room to, I guess, advocate and insist on government's role in supporting the rights of people and communities?
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to answer that, and that yes, in a way, we are letting government off the hook, and I think we have to, in turning to philanthropy or acknowledging that philanthropy is a completely legitimate and important source of funds for most organisations doing this work, and in terms of funding social movements, I do think that we have to continue our advocacy to government to properly fund this work and properly tax wealthy people to ensure that this work can be funded, because it is preferable to me that we have a proper tax system that taxes wealthy individuals so that wealth is not being accumulated in such vast ways by a small group who then are making the decisions on where this money goes. That there must be a better democratic way of doing it. So I do think we need to continue to advocate for government, and we all have to push back very hard on the limitations being put in against charities and funding advocacy work, because it is becoming an absolute nightmare. It's happened in the UK, where I am on the board of a number of organisations, and it has severely limited the way in which we can fund and advocate for causes. So I do think that we have to be very wary about not just about ensuring government funding, but also pushing back and advocating against some of the regulatory changes we're seeing that will make it even more difficult for both government funds and for charities who have tax deductible status to give money to causes. And I guess the inherent problem we face, if you are working in radical movements and social movements who are pushing for radical change, you need to identify the government funding is probably always going to be a problem. But of course, for the more sort of middle of the road causes, that's great. But it's for the edge. It's for the people on the edge that are sort of really pushing for change, and in areas that might be considered more controversial. And that's why I loved what I did working for a funder who was incredibly radical and was happy for me to fund that work. And I think we need to do some education around that, both for government and philanthropists, around why this work is so important, why it's important to fund it, and to make it less scary, because I do think the word radical scares people. It's been co-opted by all kinds of different issues and conservative governments, but actually what it means is, looking at more funding issues aimed at creating causes and movements, looking at systematic change, and that's what radical means in real terms. So I think there's an education to be done around this work and funding this work.
Thanks. I'm interested to see if anyone else wants to jump in on that, on the education that needs to be done to fund radical or rebellious work.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with Jen there that there's an education piece, and a lot of what my work is at Mutual Trust is, yes, working on strategy and administration of granting, but also just the education piece of understanding what actually will change the dial for communities and for climate, and how we can be brave and be bold with the funding that there is. And I also agree that we need to tax the rich, just to be a philanthropist on the record. But I think that taxing the rich only works if you trust the government and how they spend their money. And I think that we might not be at that point. And so I think that there's work to do, because I don't know if giving the government more power at the moment is actually the answer that we want.
And I guess, Liv, I don't know if I just jumping in here to prompt to you, but I mean, that also the question that Jen raised about the crackdown really on charitable status and what that means and the restrictions on organisations. Have you seen the impact of that in the work you've done at SEED and AYCC, and what does that look like?
Yeah, it's really hard. It really is starting to limit the types of work we can do. There's just new legislation that's proposed or coming out all the time. So not only is there capacity in our internal team to having to keep toes, eyes peeled on that, but also just it's really limiting the creativity, and we like to call it cheeky, cheeky stunts. They aren't seen as cheeky anymore. They're radical. And so it's kind of shifting the line in the actions that we can take, which is a real shame, especially in the youth movement that I've been in. People want to try different things and go out into the streets and just, communicate their messages in different ways, and that's being silenced. And so, it's against democracy as a principle, and it's really starting to affect charities as we operate. So much more paperwork, and I agree that, if we're not accepting government funding and we're just shying away from that, it might let them off the hook. But it's also hard to find the capacity to pressure against them while you're still trying to achieve your core business as well. So I've seen a few groups popping up, like Hands Off Our Charities, who bring groups together and kind of help in that middle ground piece to educate people within charities to understand what's going on and how they can fit into the guidelines, because unfortunately we'll have to if we want to keep operating, at least as to provide tax deductible receipts and those little things that keep charities going. So yeah, it's a pretty tricky landscape to work in, and I think the scary reality is that it's limiting a lot of the work that we can do in our advocacy. But I think there's, I still believe in the power of young people and everyone to think outside of those lines as well, and be able to still shine through in other ways.
We're fast running out of time here. It's been such a great discussion and so fantastic to have each of you bringing those different experiences to kind of a really tricky question. Just before we run out of time, I really wanted to just invite each of you to give one last thought, one provocative or rebellious idea that we should leave today with. Don't know if anyone just jump on in. And if anyone doesn't, I might flick to Rachel.
I'll jump in quickly. I don't think it's terribly provocative, perhaps, but just I suppose further to the conversation that we were just having around, government and taxation and all those sorts of things. Like maybe for this group of lawyers that are in this conference, maybe the most important work that they could do is tax reform.
Right. Elif?
Yeah, I think also leading into the power dynamics theme, I think we just need to learn to fundraise in ways that don't reinforce power structures. And it's not like a tangible idea, and also want to recognize what Rachel was saying about the wealth transfer. So in that intermediate pause before the wealth transfer happens, I think thinking through the phrase of tax the rich, let's also organize the rich and have intentional and deep conversations with funders and use our privilege and position to educate them and bring them into this movement of change, because I think there is a lot of education that still needs to be done with donors, from the most basic concept of overhead costs are needed to operate, to understanding and helping to uproot the systemic justice issues that are causing the problems in the first place. And I think donors have a really influential role to play in that, and we can support them in doing so.
And Catherine?
So mine's kind of tick-tacking off Liv's, and also a question that was put around funding networks. I think a really fantastic way that I'm seeing the democratization of giving is through donor circles and the increase in giving circles and donor circles in Australia, which is super, super exciting. It just means that the mums and dads, the people that can give $1,000 to $1,000 a year, can be part of a really fantastic and powerful philanthropic movement. So I would highly encourage you to consider donor circles. It's a really fantastic way of actually identifying your mid to major level donors that might be able to give into the future. And it's a really important engagement tool as well to make sure that people feel really connected with your cause and what you're doing. So yeah, my encouragement would be, yes, to consider gifts in wills programs, but also really fundamentally now, if you want to make a difference and start building your support base, donor circles and giving circles. I mean, Rachel's part of one, I'm part of one, and they're just a great way to connect in with the community, particularly during a pandemic when you want to feel more connected and out of your own bubble and to be able to give. It's a great way to do it.
Thanks, Catherine. And I might turn to Jen.
I'm just conscious that we're almost out of time. So my radical idea would be to obviously abolish wealth and philanthropy altogether, but I also acknowledge that philanthropy does play a really important role in the current structures of our society. And there are incredibly brilliant people working in philanthropy and thoughtful people like Rachel and others who are thinking through these issues in really thoughtful ways and shifting the needle, I think, on the way that philanthropy operates in this country. I think we need better transparency. We need better rules about the way that philanthropy is done. But it's important, and I think we all need to be part of the education for foundations and for family trusts around why this work is so important. And I think the Grata Fund is doing a lot of work, and we're trying to do a lot of work in bringing more philanthropists to the table and helping them understand how impactful social movement and movement litigation can be in making this a better country. So I do think that the future is brighter than it has been for a long time, and we can all work together to try and create more space for this kind of work in Australia.
Great, a great way to finish this panel, and a really big thank you to all of you, to Jen, Liv, Rachel and Catherine. It's been fantastic to be able to chat with you about all these issues.